As I said earlier, we are continuing our sermon series out of James. And that same theme of faith without works is dead. As he says, what good is it if people say they have faith, but do nothing to show it? The author of James roots that message today that we have in that royal law of love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, don't show favoritism. And he states it especially between poor and wealthy. But before we get too deep into this word from James, I want to revisit a sermon series that we had a long time ago. Well, it wasn't really that long ago, but if you're like me, it seems like a long time ago. It was back in 2019. Back just a few months after I first came here. And since that was back before COVID, that seems like it was about 500 years ago. But yeah, it was a worship series that we had actually pretty much exactly 2 years ago, in September of 2019. And during that time, we explored the story of the Exodus. It was a pivotal moment in the life of our church. We had gone from a full-time pastor to a part-time pastor, 3/4 time. We had cut the building manager position from our church, which had been a full-time position for umpteen years. And those cuts had been made because of the financial situation, that Spirit of Hope that we found ourselves in. And we had just, as of Labor Day weekend, had just closed our beloved preschool that had been a mission of our church for over 30 years. It was a harsh reality, and it hurt. It hurt deeply. And we had closed that preschool after forking over $65,000 into it over 2 months just to pay the payroll. We as Spirit of Hope had done that because we were dedicated to that preschool and to those children and families and those teachers. But we couldn't do it anymore. So we had to close it. We were in a bind, and it hurt. So we were looking at that story of Hebrews. We were looking because those Hebrew people, those Israelite people, as they were in Egypt, they were in a bind. They were slaves there in Egypt. And they were working, but those Egyptians were piling it on and piling it on and more and more and more work. And it was never going to end. The hardship that they were facing was just never going to end. And in fact, this new ruler called Pharaoh, he saw those Israelites, because they were hard workers, and they just kept growing stronger, and he was threatened by them. And so he went, our first sermon was about these midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And he went to these midwives and he said, we got to get rid of these Israelites, so I want you to kill all the boys, the Hebrew boys that are born. Well, Shiphrah and Puah, they kind of liked God. And so they were like, we can't do this. So they didn't. And when the boys were born, they hid them. Well, when Pharaoh went back to them and said, what's happening? Well, they told a little white lie, maybe a big white lie, and said, no, the Israelite women are really strong. Actually, they said they're stronger than the Egyptian women. And they have the babies before we get there. So we haven't been able to kill the boys. Now, I just want you to know that this is how Moses lived, how Moses survived in order to carry on the Hebrew lineage and in order for this story of the Exodus to continue. Now, in this first sermon, we call these Hebrew women, these Hebrew midwives, plucky. This was the word that we chose for them. Now, plucky means to have or show courage, to be determined, to be spunky. I think we could call these women spunky, and spirited. And we decided that day that we at Spirit of Hope, that we are plucky. We are plucky. And Shelda Murphy and her two sisters were sitting, we were in the other building, but they were sitting on the front row and they loved that. They went home that day and they talked about plucky all day long, and that became Shelda's favorite word. We're plucky. Now, evidence of our pluckiness. Even though we were in this financial bind that we found ourselves in, we had a mission. We found homeless people camping on our front porch. The homeless folks in our town were in a crisis. The people of Englewood, the leaders of Englewood, had to break up a camp out on the river because of, well, it was unsanitary was the number one reason. And they had broken up the camp and folks had moved into town. And some of them had set up camp on our front porch. Well, rather than chasing them away, some of our folks decided that they would come every morning at 5:30 in the morning and make relationships, build relationships with them, invite them to leave before the preschool opened. Now this was before, obviously, the preschool closed, but invite them to leave and let them know that they could come back at night and stay there. We were building relationships. Rather than kicking them out, we decided to help care for them. Now, because of this mission, we were asked to become a site for the Severe Weather Shelter Network. Here in Englewood, we would provide a place for homeless neighbors to sleep during deadly weather in the winter. Now, no one had done this in Englewood, and they needed a site because the majority of people in that program were coming from Englewood. Now, the sticking point was that the fire code in Englewood wouldn't allow us to do it. But we're plucky, so we didn't let this stop us. And we worked with the city council, or maybe we should say we fought for, we didn't fight with, we fought for a change in the ordinance. And by the end of that year, we got it. Now then, we had to work really hard to change stuff in our building so that we met the new fire code, but we managed to get it changed. We're plucky, and we were all for serving the homeless, our homeless neighbors. Now, we also, a sign of our pluckiness, we were eternally optimistic. We got to the end of 2019, and we looked at our budget during that charge conference. And we were $45,000 short. We were $45,000 short. Now, rather than saying, oh, okay, we're going to lay down and, just, no. We were like, okay, we're gonna make this work. We were working hard to renovate our building in order to rent it out. We got a grant from the Methodist Foundation to help us do this. We had worked with the director of the Chamber of Commerce who had ideas of how we could make this work. Gary Condry had a business leader in the community who was helping us figure out how this might work. We were plucky. We were trying. We were courageous. We were determined to close that $45,000 gap. Now, you might say that it was a dream and a prayer, and that probably was true. But it kept us dreaming. and it kept us hoping. Not sure how we would have made up $45,000 in a year when we were starting with a building that was run down and such, but we were dreamers. In January of 2020, Billy Waters came to me, the pastor of Wellspring Church, and proposed a church swap. Swapping the building we're sitting in now for our older building that had a lot of physical problems. Leaky roof, it flooded when it rained. The utilities costs were so much we couldn't afford it. We were $45,000 short on our budget. He had made the same proposal to us when Chris was pastor of the church. However, Chris had told him our annual conference is not going to go for this, and our annual conference has to approve building sales because they were not going to let that prime property go. But in the financial situation that we were in, I called Paul Cockey, our district superintendent at the time, and I said, this is where we are, $45,000 short. And this is what I'm concerned about, and this is the offer that's on the table. They were interested. And they were interested because they did not want Spirit of Hope to close. They didn't want us to close. And so the conversation started. So that was in February, really, along that time that the conversation started. Now, when we started this sermon series on Exodus, there was no way that we could have predicted what this year would have looked like. No way. I just want to say that now because, a few weeks into these conversations in March, COVID hit. And the world shut down overnight. So at this point, I'm going to pull up another story that we used in our sermon series on the Exodus. This was one of the many times that the Israelites thought that for sure Moses and Aaron had brought them out to the wilderness just so they could die. It was one of the times that they said, we know you brought us out here just so we could starve to death. You should have left us in Egypt. At least there we could have sat where we're used to sitting and died there. The scripture passage says that they were complaining. Another translation talks about that they're murmuring. I love that. We even talked about it in the sermon series. You can imagine the way, because in churches it always happens, doesn't it? Every church. It's people in the background, and you can imagine it in the huge crowd of the Israelites who are marching along. It usually starts in the back, and the murmuring starts, and then it grows, and then it's the complaining until it erupts. You've brought us out here to die. We had to go through the process of selling the property in the middle of COVID. There could not have been a set of worse circumstances for this, for our congregation. We could not come together to talk about this. We were not meeting on Sundays where we could even talk like this right here about it. Half of our congregation does not have internet. So we could not, and the half that does are not familiar with anything like Zoom. To have a Zoom conversation. It was just impossible to have the kind of dialogue that needed to happen for this to go like we normally would have it go, or like we wanted to have it go. And all of us complained. We all murmured and we all complained. We sent out letters, we sent out emails, we had opportunities for people to call the guiding board members and talk to them one-on-one. We set up opportunities for people to come and sit down with the guiding board in person. In the end, the guiding board had to vote because we could not pull people together for everyone to vote because of COVID. Now, the other thing in this story of where everyone on the Exodus was complaining is that God provided manna for these people and rained down manna so that it was available in the morning. They could only gather what they needed, and they needed for each day, except on the Sabbath, and they could gather for 2 days. But gather what they needed for that day. The harsh reality, again, is that because of COVID, we likely would have closed our doors in 2020. We were $45,000 short on that budget in 2019, or for 2020. We were hoping to rent out our building. That never would have happened in the middle of COVID. We never would have had that happen. With the building swap, we right-sized our building. And then the annual conference managed to find a way so that we could use that money for operating expenses. Typically, that money would only go to capital expenses. But we were able to use it for operating expenses. We were given a lifeline. We were given manna in the wilderness. And we didn't have to close. And this happened because, one, we're plucky, and we were optimistic, we were hopeful, and they didn't want to close us, because that's who we are. This all has been hard. It's all been beyond hard. It would have been hard under normal circumstances. But to do all of this during COVID, which COVID by itself would have been hard, but to do all of this during COVID was hard. And if you don't feel like unicorns, rainbows, and cotton candy after hearing all this and the recap of this story, then you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Plucky people are not people who sugarcoat things. Plucky people are people who meet reality with courage and determination. Now, in the spirit of the book of James, I want to highlight that throughout all of this, your commitment to our homeless neighbors has remained strong. Using James' language, you have shown mercy. You have loved your neighbor. Now, as we fought to work around the fire codes in Inglewood, we traveled to other churches to run the Severe Weather Shelter Network during our rotation for that program. And just recently, in the last few weeks, our guiding board voted for us to become the central location for our region for the Severe Weather Shelter Network. Now, what that means is, during COVID and because of COVID, we're not housing people in churches any longer. We're housing them in motels. But anytime we're going to be housing during this time, the volunteers from all over our region are going to come here to our building, and they're going to pack the meals here. And then they're going to go from here to the motels where our homeless neighbors are staying and deliver those meals. In addition, we're going to have the folks coming here on the days when they need to get vouchers to pick up those vouchers. Our church, our plucky little church, is serving every way that it can. We may be small, but we are mighty. We are maybe small, but we're mighty, and we are doing everything that we can. We may not have the hundreds of volunteers that some of these other churches have, but we give what we can. And because of that, we're giving big. Now, another group that we have reached out to are those who are not being blessed by knowing the love and mercy of God. They don't yet know, and they have not yet come to know the love and mercy of God. And that has been a vision of this church for years. I was hired 3/4 time in 2019. Half of that money came from the operating budget of Spirit of Hope. 1/4 time of that budget money, and that money was meant or set aside to pay for the ministry of the existing ministry of Spirit of Hope. 1/4 of that time was paid from the Emmanuel building funds. And that was to go to new ministry, into a new ministry, running parallel to the Spirit of Hope ministry. And that new ministry was reaching out to people who were not currently being served by anyone in the community. That vision of those two ministries, that they would run alongside each other. In 2020, the annual conference took over that 1/4 time salary. We're going to talk a little further about that timeline later in our town hall. But in the spirit of James, we have an opportunity here to minister to all people between Spirit of Hope and between our new ministry, across the age spectrum. We don't have the beautiful pitter-patter of toddler feet here with us today, but we often do. The Zimmerman babies. But we have the full age spectrum, newborn to death. We have our 100-year-old Vera here with us, our 98-year-old Pat here with us. We have, and we have belief spectrum. Those who are cradle Christians, and those we have agnostics in the lantern. Ability spectrum. We have those who are here with us worshiping today. We have those with the Spirit of Hope who can't leave their homes and then are ministered to. Their financial spectrum. That's what James speaks to here in the gospel. Across the spectrum. Race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. The opportunities for mercy, to reach beyond our walls, to the homeless and those waiting. There's one more story I want to touch on. Please advance. We talked about not shown in this sermon series. And this is a story out of Jewish Midrash. It's a story that goes along with the parting of the Red Sea. So this is after the Hebrews have left Egypt, and they are right at the Red Sea. Pharaoh has given second thought to letting them leave and has decided he's going to have his armies chase them and catch them. So Pharaoh and his armies are bearing down on them. The Israelites turn back and can see that they're coming. And Moses has said that God's going to part the Red Sea, but it's not happening. So according to Midrash, what happens is Nachshon realizes that someone's got to take the first step. And so Nachshon steps forward and walks up to the sea. And he takes a step and he puts that toe in. And then he walks a little further and his ankles are in. Nothing's happening. On in with his knees and nothing's happening. Hips, chest, chin, and he's up to his nose, and he's taken that last step in where the water will be over his head. And it's a question of whether he has the faith that God will provide. And that God will be with those Israelites on this journey to the promised land. And so he takes that final step, and as he does, the sea parts. And there is dry land. Today we are talking about the future. And it's two ministries that are before us, and both ministries have a future. And it's not a question of whether the ministries have a future, because they both do. It's just a ministry of how we step forward into those ministries, and there are a lot of options. And they're all viable options. It's just a question of how is it that we're going to do it? And how is it that we trust God to be with us on that journey? God has been with us on this journey all along. And we've been in this journey together. We're plucky people. We're plucky people. Courageous, determined, brave. Amen. And now Tanya's going to share a gift of music with us.
Yeah, and I'm thinking what to sing today, I'm just thinking, going through a few songs, and I was just amazing all the time how Holy Spirit leads and make the whole sermon, match in one subject. And I think this song is going to fit really well in today's perspective.